We are in part 7 of series discussing human rights in Slovenia. Part 7, Maria decided. I very gladly agree that we will start from last part when I mentioned the existence of Slovene National Army, Slovenska narodna vojska, and Maria will explain how deep and how much she can lecture us on this topic, because why lecture us in Slovenia? Because this topic has not been thoroughly processed, engaged neither during, of course, the years of social communism, and even not in the last 35 years of Slovenian independence. This has a lot to do with the quality of general quality of historical science in Slovenia. I have checked COBIS, which is Slovene library catalog. I have checked YouTube, Trends, Google Trends, and last but not least, GROK, artificial intelligence from X. And what the results were, how much books are there on Slovenska narodna vojska, Slovene National Army, which effectively, semi-officially, lasted for only a few days or weeks. But then four authors, 4 books are mentioned. Boris Mlakar, Slovensko domobranstvo, Slovene Home Guard, from 43 to 45. Then Tamara Griser-Pečar, Razdvojeni narod, The Nation Divided, Slovenia 41-45. Then Jože Rand, Slovene Exodus of year 45. And fourth one, Tomáš Kladnik, Slovenska partizanska in domobranska vojska, Slovene Partisan and Home Guard Army, which was made in 2006. I'm watching, all those books are made between 2003 and 2008. And then we don't have any additional larger works on that, apart from small articles, short articles. And then there is almost nothing in COBIS, almost nothing practically in YouTube. It's non-existing topic. And to finish the radio television of Slovenia, which is so-called public media, the main post-communist media, it has had one documentary film, which is completely different aspects of that period at the end of the Second World War, which was Day of Victory by Zvezdan Martić, 2025, and some rare short shows, more or less on radio, I would say. So, Maria, why do we have to talk about Slovenska narodna vojska if we want to know the broader picture, even in legal terms, because it does change some aspects? And my first question in before you begin with anything, was it necessary for the red deep state of past years, especially before the independence, to hide this topic as much as possible? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Blaž. It is interesting to start out with a question like that. That's more of a political question than a legal question. And I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that. I think maybe a historian might be better at it. Because I don't know factually if they intentionally hid it or whether they were somewhat unaware of it. It depends who's writing. Certainly, if one searched the National Archives, military documents in Belgrade, the fact that the Slovenian National Army existed was certainly there. But I'm not certain when some of these documents were placed into the archives. I've placed one of them myself, National Committee for Slovenia, written in English. I did so in 2023. I found this copy in my middle of my files that my father left me, that he maybe smuggled to the United States at that time. I have not found another document in English. And I published it in a book. And when I went to the archives, they said they had the document, but they only actually had part of what I had. So the document I have fully describes the Slovene National Army. So I'm not sure I can fully answer your question, but what I can answer is questions about legal characterization, which I need to talk about as a lawyer, because what I've found is a dearth of information, meaning nobody's talking about these issues from a legal point of view. And that's very important because theoretically, if we were to have a court today that would examine the behavior and possible criminality, first of all, of each army formation that existed during World War II and the individuals that were part of these armies, the courts would look at their behavior, would legally characterize each army, and they would be looking at it from a legal point of view primarily, not from a political point of view. And from what I see, almost all the literature is written from a political point of view. So, as you said, and thank you for researching the Slovenian National Army, the research and, of course, artificial intelligence is wonderful for covering, asking additional information we might not have thought of, for finding sources we may not be aware of. However, I would caution that we can't be sure just by reading artificial intelligence that it's found everything, because, of course, it can only find what is actually available to it online. There are many sources that are not entered or not entered in that fashion. For example, in the archives, Slovenian Ljubljana archives, there are many kinds of documents in there, but a number of them are not categorized individually. You might find the stacks of document in boxes. For example, one of the areas I research are the secret underground activities of the underground network, anti-communist network that began in 1941 in Ljubljana. There are many telegrams written by this organization and its representatives to and from MI6 in London, principally from 1941 to 1943. If you search that, you will not find it because they have not been individually scanned into any type of organized system that can be retrieved by artificial intelligence. I scan them, so I have them, but very few historians do. Anyway, I want to return to, I started this by saying I would discuss the Slovenian National Army, but I'm going to need to talk about what a legal characterization is and why I'm doing it, because that's very important, and it's going to set the foundation probably for my discussion over the next few weeks. However, in short, as you said, what was the Slovene National Army? It was proposed and ultimately proclaimed as the national military force of the non-communist Slovenian political movement at the end of the Second World War. It was publicly constituted in May 1945, but what you may not get, again, from artificial intelligence is that the ideas and foundations for the Slovene National Army did not start in May 1945. They started with the Vaška Straža, the village guard, in 1943. So its plans were long in the making, long before it was formally constituted in 1945. After it the origins were developed during wartime, also during war, it was further developed by the Royal Yugoslav military, by General Vladimir Vavnik and his clandestine efforts in 1944. And so then it was formally organized by the National Committee for Slovenia in January 1945. Their purpose was not simply to create another armed formation, but they wanted to reorganize the existing Slovene anti-communist military forces into a unified Slovenian National Army under a common command and political authority. So in common vernacular, we hear people discussing how the Home Guard fled to Austria, fleeing from the communists and Tito, and that the British repatriated the Home Guard. Actually, they were no longer the Home Guard. They had become the Slovene National Army. They were not under as an auxiliary force of Germany, but they were under the command of King Peter in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, who they had sworn an oath to already in January 1945. And then again, they weren't even active soldiers; they were refugees. But that's the topic of another day. It's too much to cover in one time. So, having said that introductory part about the Slovene National Army, I need to talk about why a legal characterization of each army that operated in Slovenia in 1945 is important, because I'm going to apply and have applied these standards to every army: the partisans, home guards, Chetniks, Yugoslav army, village guards, and the Germans. And then only by applying equal standards to each army can we properly give them a legal characterization. So we can separate political discussion from legal characterization. Again, theoretically, if any of this were to go before an international tribunal, which at this point it's not, but we have to consider this if we're thinking of terms of reconciliation of the country in the future, we need to think about what would a modern international court say today, and they would primarily be looking at the legal characterization of each army, the individual behavior of the soldiers, not the political characterization. We often hear,
May I just add
yes,
that we have been living in totally political environment and completely lack of any legal substance regarding this topic. And it's
yes,
beautiful to inform the people in general that these topics, after they are processed in legal terms, they actually appear quite a little bit different.
yes, I do think they appear quite different. And I'll give some examples of how it helps both people who are sympathetic to home guards and partisans. Um, and I think, based on our discussions, that I'm going to write a legal article on the Slovenian National Army as well. And I have been writing on the legal characterization on my website. So, as you say, it's been primarily categorized with political labels. And what are those? Liberators, collaborators, traitors, revolutionaries, resistance fighters. These all describe political allegiance, ideology, or historical interpretation. but they do not determine whether an organization or its individual members had a particular legal status or committed a crime. For example, the Slovenian Partisans might be politically characterized by some as a communist-led revolutionary movement that fought the Axis occupation while simultaneously seeking to seize political power and eliminate its anti-communist opponents. Legally, however, they were an organized belligerent force participating in an armed conflict. Their members were subject to and protected by the laws and customs of war while remaining individually responsible for war crimes. On the other hand, the Slovene Home Guard might be politically characterized as an anti-communist force, one that collaborated with the German occupiers. Legally, however, it is characterized more precisely as an organized Slovenian armed formation operating within the German occupation system, which is legal, and whose relationship with the occupying power must be distinguished from the legal status and the conduct of particular units and individuals. To reiterate what I've said in prior weeks, Germans committed many crimes. That does not mean that the Slovene Home Guard members are responsible for those crimes. We need to look at what they individually did. So legal characterization replaces politically charged collective labels within the legally relevant questions. Some of the questions that I'm asking when determining the legal characterization of an army are: who commanded the force? To whom was it legally responsible? Was it a belligerent? And I'll define that. What law governed its conduct? What rights did its members possess? And that's very important in war. If soldiers want to be part of a legal armed force, all because if they are fighting within their legal force, then they are not subject to, let's say, charges of murder when they kill other soldiers in the process of fighting for that force. If they are a guerrilla force or individually operating, they can be charged. So a Home Guard member fighting against the partisans in a conflict cannot be charged under international law with a crime for killing partisan fighters within the laws of the war, as long as they don't violate other laws of the war, which is like murdering someone outside of the time of engagement and a few other definitions. So what specific conduct gives rise to individual criminal liability? And we went over those, a number of those last year: murder, torture, rape, killing soldiers after they've been disarmed, imprisoned. Those are all violations. Those are all war crimes. This distinction is essential because political allegiance is not itself a crime. Slovene Home Guards being pledging allegiance to King Peter in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia is not a crime. Partisan soldiers pledging allegiance to either their partisan, political, even communist command, or whatever it might have been, is not itself a crime. And military cooperation with an occupying power does not automatically establish individual criminal responsibility. Participation in a politically legitimate resistance movement does not immunize an individual from liability for war crimes. For example, if you're a partisan soldier and you are part of a legitimate resistance movement, do you have the right to imprison Home Guards, take away their weapons, and then kill them all? Let's say after the Battle of Turyak. No. It does not immunize them from committing a war crime just because they are part of a recognized military force. They still have to follow the laws of war. And I've already answered my second question, but I've already gone over this. Would an international tribunal examine the political or legal characterization? Primarily, they would examine the legal characterization, not political, although political and historical evidence may be relevant for factual context. So, A tribunal would not ordinarily decide criminal responsibility simply by determining that a force was communist, or that it was royalist, or that it was collaborationist, or resistance force, or traitors. Instead, it would determine the applicable law, the legal status of the armed organization and its members, the nature of the armed conflict, the status of the victims, and the specific conduct and mental state of the accused. So while political objectives and affiliations could be evidence relevant to motive, organizational structure, command relationships, or the existence of a policy or plan, do not themselves establish an international crime. So, an international tribunal would ask whether a partisan, Home Guard, Chetnik, Slovenian National Army member committed conduct satisfying the elements of a crime under applicable international law. They would not simply ask whether that person belonged to a politically favorable or unfavorable army. So, in summary, legal characterization is the bridge between the historical fact of belonging to an army and the legally provable question of individual criminal responsibility. Now, another topic, give me a second, I want to take a sip of water here. If we were in a video conference, you could see me do that. I want to answer a question people often have. Would an international tribunal examine witness statements in addition to more formal historical documents? I've noticed that many historians in Slovenia really rely on the historical documents, perhaps less witness statements and testimonies. But in fact, in an international tribunal where there are few documents, certainly when I was at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, often we had to rely primarily on witness statements because in general, Yugoslavia doesn't keep good records. Very different, for example, than Germans who keep very good records. And so because they were missing, that doesn't mean there isn't any evidence. In a court of law, often the witness statement, first person statement, is often the best kind of evidence. But it's important to evaluate the witness, what position they were in. Were they interviewed immediately after the incident or 30 years later because people can forget, etc. So in general, an international tribunal ordinarily examines both witness testimony and documentary evidence. This is how I view it. The sources, Blaž, that you cited are excellent, and they might be some of the primary sources, but there are also books of people who have survived, who went through World War II, let's say were part of this secret underground movement, who have recorded those. And I don't know that they're coming up in COBIS yet, but I'm aware of a number of them. They described being members of the Slovenian National Army. For example, in the biography I'm going to publish on my father, Joseph Velikonja, he described how at the very end they were being sworn in as the new army of the Slovenian National Army. I haven't published that yet, so it's not yet in COBIS, but it will be, and of those. But I find those equally as important as the historians. The formal documents like military orders, organizational charts, government decrees, correspondence reports, contemporaneous records can establish an organization's structure, command relationships, policies, while witness statements provide evidence of what actually occurred on the ground. And as someone who is a practitioner, I worked in the war on the ground in Bosnia and Croatia, I know it's very important to get the perspective of people who went through the war, because it's very different than being an armchair detective or armchair historian, as I like to put it, someone who has never been in that position. And it's important to get both. Witness evidence can corroborate, clarify, or sometimes contradict a picture presented by formal documents, and that's why it's very important to have them. And that's true, especially when records were destroyed, were deliberately concealed. And as you know, Blaž, approximately 90% of the documents that UDBA collected were intentionally destroyed. So it's hard to get a picture of everything that UDBA did simply by the records that remain in the archives in Ljubljana because they were intentionally destroyed. It's important to get the perspective of witnesses living through that time who may have been interrogated, interviewed, witness to crimes that UDBA committed to corroborate official documents. An international tribunal assesses the forms of evidence for reliability, consistency, corroboration, and relevance. And this is particularly important for World War II Slovenia and later political narratives because they may differ sharply from contemporaneous records and determining legal status and individual responsibility. Right now, I'm going to give two examples here. So the question is, how does a legal characterization of each army that operated in World War II Slovenia benefit the individual soldiers who were part of that army? So I have two examples. One is on the Slovene Partisans and the other is on the Slovene National Army. So a legal characterized belligerent force, which it was for the beginning of the war. It was the official Yugoslav force at the end. They changed. But a legal characterization of this army benefits ordinary partisan soldiers by separating their lawful participation in wartime armed conflict from post-war massacres carried out by separate security organizations such as OSNA and KNOI. If an individual partisan soldier fought during the war as a member of the partisans of an organized belligerent force, his mere membership in the partisan army cannot establish responsibility for killings committed by other organizations or units. He is not responsible for crimes committed by OSNA, the mass murders happened after the war, because we're looking at individual criminal responsibility. Most ordinary partisan soldiers had no idea that that happened. That information was kept from them. A court would look for individual criminal responsibility. It requires evidence connecting the particular person to the criminal conduct. That person must personally commit, order, aid, or participate in that killing. Command responsibility, which is the people who ordered those, that would have to be proved, demonstrating superior relationship, requisite knowledge, orders given, etc. So legally characterizing the partisans as a belligerent force does not exonerate partisan members who actually participated in wartime or post-war massacres, but it does protect the ordinary soldier who fought as a partisan and had no knowledge, participation, or control over over the killings. He cannot properly be assigned collective criminal responsibility merely because he belonged to the partisan movement. It was not illegal to be part of the partisan movement. Now, looking at the Slovene National Army, the same principle works in the other direction. If the Slovene National Army is legally characterized as a de facto organized Slovenian national belligerent force, technically I would characterize them as the National Army for Slovenia, however. But either way, it's conduct and command relationships rather than according, for example, to the conduct of German occupation forces. Because some of their formations, most of the Slovenian National Army had been part of the Home Guard after all, which was an auxiliary force operating under a German umbrella. And they cannot legally inherit criminal responsibility for every crime committed by the German army, simply because some of the Slovenian anti-communist forces had cooperated with Germany before being reorganized into the Slovene National Army. Individual Slovene National Army members would be responsible for German crimes only if evidence established their own participation, assistance, orders with an actual crime, not just being a member of the Home Guard or the Slovene National Army. That's not sufficient. Commanders of the Slovene National Army could incur responsibility for crimes of their own subordinates, but only if the requirements for individual or command responsibility were satisfied. So, the legal characterization of the Slovene National Army as a distinct belligerent force or as the national force of Slovenia, it establishes a legal boundary between the Slovene National Army and the German occupation forces. Neither political association nor prior cooperation of some units automatically transforms German crimes into Slovene National Army crimes or makes the Slovene National Army member individual responsible for them. I want to briefly go over some of the underlying law that is examined. And I'm not going to go in this in detail, but I'll summarize the law from which these principles are obtained. And these are the laws, the international laws that need to be examined when trying to legally characterize an army. Again, it's to distinguish legal responsibility from political, ideological, or historical perspective. So, sources of international law, which are lists, are the Fourth Hague Convention, and that's from 1907, because again, we are applying the law as it existed in 1945 or between 1941 and 1945, not the later Geneva Conventions of 1949. So this is called treaty law. The Hague Convention, Fourth Hague Convention of 1907, Hague Regulations, Geneva Convention relative to prisoners of war of 1929. You'll recall that we discussed that last week. There was also Geneva Convention for the Wounded and the Sick, 1929. And these four concepts form the legal foundation for analyzing the status of every armed organization operating in Slovenia during the Second World War. I've gone over these before. The Hague Convention, Fourth Convention, is very important because it's the principal treaty governing land warfare during the Second World War. Its focus is different than the later Geneva Conventions because the focus is primarily on protection of victims of war, and it addresses the conduct of hostilities, the rights and duties of belligerents, military occupation, and the treatment of public and private property. Much of it was codified, written down like a statute from pre-existing customs of war that existed before World War II. The Nuremberg Tribunal then, after 1945 and later, confirmed that by 1939, many provisions of these Hague regulations from 1907 had become binding customary international law. And they are bound upon states, upon countries that had not even ratified every single treaty. So for any legal analysis of Slovenia between 1941 and 1945, these Hague regulations apply. They establish the duties, limitations of occupying powers, Germany, Italy, and Hungary. They specify the conditions under which militias may qualify as lawful belligerents, and they provide the legal framework for evaluating the legal status of the occupation authorities and other armed organizations, including partisans, village guards, Royal Yugoslav Army, then Chetniks, Slovene Home Guard, Primorska Home Guard, and the Slovene National Army. I'm not going to go through it, but I'll post it. Law of occupation, law of war before 1949. I want to read through the law, the definition of belligerent, because I have been discussing it, and it is relevant to any legal characterization for armies that existed prior to 1945. So, during the Second World War, the term belligerent referred to states, countries, under certain circumstances, organized armed forces that were legally recognized as parties to an armed conflict. So, all of the non-occupying forces I've been discussing were belligerent. And they're entitled to the exercise of rights and bear the the obligations of the laws of war. So, under the Hague Regulations of 1907, the armed forces of a belligerent state included not only regular armies, but they also include militias and volunteer corps that satisfied four conditions. Okay, so these are the four conditions that I look at to assess the legal characterization of any army. Number one, they were commanded by a person responsible for subordinates. Number two, they had a fixed distinctive emblem recognizable at a distance. Number three, they carried arms openly. And number four, they conducted their operations in accordance with the laws and customs of war. So, if you think about the armed forces that that existed during World War II Slovenia, you may think that pretty much all of them had this, and that's not by accident. That's because they were trying to conform to this international regulation of 1907 so that they could attain the status of belligerents. It's not an accident. So, when these forces when the individual soldiers are captured, they are generally supposed to be and entitled to prisoner of war status rather than be treated as ordinary criminals. The Hague Regulations therefore distinguish lawful belligerents from civilians who may have taken up arms without meeting these conditions. So, as a short aside, to get away just from giving definitions, last week we talked about how the British, before they repatriated the former Slovene Home Guard, or as we now know it, the former Slovenian National Army, back to Tito in Yugoslavia, they put them into a category that they called surrendered enemy personnel. But if you're now following with the discussion here, you will understand that they should either have been categorized as prisoner of war, or my argument is as refugees. Because the Slovene Home Guard and the Slovene National Army certainly met these four conditions that I just read. Occupation. I don't want to read all this, but generally I think it's understood that Slovenia was occupied by Germany, Italy, and Hungary.
And
Um,
Croatia. And Croatia, let's not
yes,
forget.
yes, we can go and on. I actually don't discuss Hungary much, just for the sake of brevity, but that small part in southern Slovenia was also occupied by Croatia. I just had another sip of water. Okay, so just to briefly mention auxiliary forces during the Second World War, they were generally understood to be armed organizations that supported the military or security operations of a state without constituting part of its regular armed forces. So we can say legally that the Slovene Home Guard was an auxiliary force of the German army. And it's important the concept of auxiliary force is important because several of the indigenous armed organizations were created or employed to assist the German or the Italian occupation forces. Village Guard were the auxiliary force of the Italians. That's a little more complicated question. I'm not going to get into that now, but it's certainly a discussion. There's the term combatant. During the Second World War, the term combatant referred to persons who were legally entitled to participate directly in hostilities on behalf of a belligerent party, and if captured, were generally entitled to treatment as prisoners of war rather than just having been someone that took part in fighting. Then the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to treatment of prisoners of war complement the rules by regulating the treatment of captured members of such forces. And at that time, the law distinguished primarily between lawful combatants who were entitled, theoretically at least, although it didn't happen, to prisoner of war status upon capture versus civilians. And I say theoretically because the partisans were not known to take prisoners of war. The people I've spoken to who were partisans and who were willing to speak said that the partisans did not take prisoners of war, they killed them. So, but the partisans were governed by these same regulations, and if they were following the laws and customs of war, they were required to take prisoners of war and treat them humanely. There were irregular forces as well. At various stages of the war, the Slovene Partisans were irregular forces, and so was the Yugoslav Army or Chetnik units, although their status changed. It's my position, upon my analysis of the Chetnik units, the Royal Yugoslav Army, that then operated as Chetniks. Certainly at the beginning of the war, they were the official Royal Yugoslav Army, but according to international law, they remained the national legal force, army force for Yugoslavia until the end of the war, and that's only because the Allies in 1944, maybe earlier, started supporting the partisans. But that was a political move. That doesn't change the legal characterization of the Yugoslav Royal Army, and they were in fact the National Army of Yugoslavia until the end of the war. I have only 10 minutes left, and I've barely gotten through anything. Do you want to say a few things here, Blaž, or I can certainly continue?
May I interrupt with some remarks?
Yes.
Brainstorm again.
Yes.
So first
Yes.
is the partisans also did not have it. Anybody can correct me, but as far as I know, the so-called partisans were having hard time presenting themselves as official army, and German occupiers and other occupiers for years have not taken them seriously as something else than so-called bandits or forest people, hostari, or similar, or communists. I don't know what were all the labels. So they were never taken as prisoners of war, and they were summarily executed as well. So that
by the German army or by who?
Germans, for example, in
Mm-hmm.
Stari Piskor in Celje,
Right.
there was a big execution ground for hostages, for mass shootings.
Right. But the German army wasn't known for following many rules of law, rules of war. But go ahead.
Yeah, that was just a remark, and then
Correct.
another remark is that I checked Google Trends under Slovenska narodna vojska, and there were no searches. I'm talking about the period from 2004 until now.
Mm-hmm.
No searches, like so, and yeah. The third is more philosophical and detective. Looking back, we know that I can explain a story that I heard, which was rather sad and I believe classical. That one of the partisans came back home and he was asked to go to search for some homeboys in some settlements, and he succeeded convincing them that they will be fine, and they went along with him, and later on they were executed, all of them, or something like that. These things happened when you mentioned Ozna and Knoi, but many individuals have been tainted by, willing or not, participate in larger scale cleansings of bourgeois, of anyone smelling of intelligentsia and stuff like that. So these were just passing remarks, if you can comment on any of them. So what I'm saying, and you said that documents have been destroyed, but in reverse engineering, you can estimate the level of psychological secret service, secret police pressure. I might mention that on X just today there was mentioned a story of a Slovene public young politician mentioning that UDBA has not done a job good enough, something like that. So the political police and the political narrative is still fixed in Slovene psyche, and the legal aspects only now can slowly return to the consciousness of Slovene legal or other audiences. Please.
Yeah, I agree with all that. What I've noticed with many Slovenians who grew up during communism and went to school during communism, especially those who haven't really examined these issues beyond school, is that the impressions that were made during school are those that they feel are correct or believe. And they may have been taught that 50 years ago, but they still think that's what is correct. And it's difficult to get them to examine beyond that. Partly is, I believe, communism did not encourage analysis, critical thinking. And so part of the problem is a number of people simply never learned those skills, which in a democracy, of course, you learn from the first day you go to kindergarten. So actually, I can't imagine trying to learn that after a lifetime of not being encouraged to use critical thought. So I agree that change will be very slow. In addition to that, in the last 30 some years, the legal characterization has not been introduced. And so Slovenia is behind on that as well. So I agree it's going to take some time, but there's no time like the present to start, correct?
Always the same. So the level of missing documents again is considerable. And once I was listening to who is that mayor of Radenci, Leljak. He was describing the spread of the density of UDBA elements all over Slovenia, the control that was imposed upon the civilian population. These are supposedly humongous numbers, and majority of those agents, as if I remember correctly, were focused on prevention of nationalism and separatism.
Yeah.
And so they were not dealing with, let's say, crime, but political activities of civilians, of their thought. It was thought engineering all the time.
Yes, there was a lot of disinformation. That's a term from the Russians, I believe. Yeah, I mean it's a combination, two-part problem. As you say, UDBA OSNA, then UDBA agents are trained a certain way. Certainly, they're recruited primarily for their ability to be assassins. So I assume they had a number of psychopaths or sociopaths. They had to prove that they could assassinate someone. And secondly, they were given extraordinary powers beyond any type of organization that exists in any known democracy. So they terrorized the local population in addition to having such influence over anti-communists from World War II and after that. If I can give a personal example, and it's my family, so I won't mention the name, but one of my aunts was an OSNA and UDBA agent, known very well to my family. In 1942, and I have proven this because she was overheard on the radio, she ordered the assassination of her own father. And he was later found where it was discussed on the radio. And she did this in order to prove her bona fides, to prove that she could get the job in Osna. And then she was a political commissar at the time, but then she did get hired. And then she was later responsible for the torture and imprisonment of my grandmother. They took advantage of the fact that they could terrorize people who they disliked, they had a history with. My family on that side was bourgeois. They had money. And so, as was the case with many cases of families in Oslo, some of the motivation was seizing their personal property and taking away their civil rights. By taking away their civil rights and imprisoning them, they could more easily take away their 20 parcels of land and all the property they owned in their home, etc. And since they had unfettered and unchecked power, they could really do what they want. And I can't think of a more type of terrorizing force than one that is given such power over a population. So therefore, no one can speak out against them. So I have to say that
May I just
if I
intervene
could just
with
finish that sentence, just
no?
say that I recognize that not just those who opposed communism were terrorized by Osna, but they terrorized pretty much all the people in Slovenia. Go ahead.
My addition is only that also the singing was rather sometimes forbidden of Slovene national songs. As I heard,
And
for some time in Gostilnas, it was not welcomed situation. There were all the time there were some agents in the pubs in Gostilnas.
yeah, so my understanding is that agents were everywhere. And there were
Exactly,
far more.
every
Right, I
village.
forgot how many there were per 100 people, but it was far, far above what would be considered average for a democratic national police force or all democracies have an
If
intelligence
I
agency.
remember
And
correctly,
nothing
Leliak
like
said
that.
that Slovenia had a measurably more UDBA agents per capita as other republics.
Yeah, other than other Yugoslav republics, in that they were fiercer, more cruel, more active as well. Again, that's what I've read. I'm not a historian, but that's my understanding of reading historical accounts.
Just one more impression from life. I've heard another similar story that some lady went to, I don't know where, but she met a woman from Germany, and then she said where she is from, so Slovenia, and this German lady said, "Oh, oh, yes, this was very brutal," something like that. So the world around us knew that something happened here in general.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Can I describe a little more of the National Slovene Army? I'm going to obviously have to continue this next week because I've far more material, just for like a few minutes here, and then I'll give a little summation. As I discussed earlier, the origins of the Slovene National Army were far earlier than 1945, as early as 1943. The January 1945 organization placed the Slovenian National Army within the constitutional framework of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, with King Peter as its supreme commander and the National Committee of Slovenia exercising supreme command functions until normal constitutional government could be restored. So the existing anti-communist formations, and that included Slovene National Home Guard, Slovene Royalist or Chetniks forces, the Primorska domobranci and Gorenska domobranci formations, and other units associated with the Royal Yugoslav military, they were all to be incorporated or reorganized within the Slovenian National Army structure. And they came up with this in 1943. So this is very significant from a legal characterization point of view. It also affects the legal characterization of the other anti-communist armies, like the Slovenian Home Guard, which I'll need to talk to about another time, because motivation, this kind of planning, needs to be considered at the same time and against fact as an auxiliary force of the German army. So this organization that I'm talking about here with the Slovenian National Army should not be equated with the Slovene Home Guard, but rather it represented an attempt to transform previously separate anti-communist armed forces into a unified Slovenian national military organization. It had its own command hierarchy and a political allegiance to the Slovenian nation, King Peter II, and the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. The commander was not Leon Rupnik. He had been the senior commander and inspector of the Slovene Home Guard, but the Slovenian National Army was a new, broader military organization. It intended to incorporate the Home Guard and other anti-communist forces and unify them. And so in January 1945, by a decree by the Slovenian National Army, General Ivan Precelj was appointed commander of the Slovenian National Army with Colonel Mirko Bitenc as his deputy. So the organization initially had a command structure distinct from that of the Home Guard. And again, this is back in January 1945, not at the end of the war. This constitutional framework placed King Peter II of Yugoslavia at the head, the apex of the military hierarchy, as the supreme commander. Then the January 1945 decree also provided that the king was the supreme commander, while the National Committee for Slovenia, which is a political organization, would exercise the functions of supreme command until normal constitutional conditions could be restored. Now, I have not said yet, but it is important to reiterate that it never was able to fully carry out its functions as an army because they went to Austria. I mean, that was the end of the war. They had to flee the partisans. So I'm talking more about their intent and their written plans, which are significant when conducting a legal characterization. But if you're looking at what they actually accomplished, they were not actually able to accomplish what they set out to do. So the command structure in the final stage was King Peter II as supreme commander, and the National Committee for Slovenia was the provisional Slovenian political authority. Franz Krenner was the commander of the Slovene National Army, and he did go to Austria with the Slovene Home Guard of the Slovene National Army, and he was in discussions with the British. Many will criticize his actions. I'll leave that to historians. But the fact was that he had not been the supreme commander of the Slovene Home Guard. He was there with the British, and the British knew, therefore, that he was the commander of the Slovene National Army. I don't think many people have realized that. Are you following this, Blaž? It's an interesting
Yeah.
perspective here, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So, because you always say Home Guard, but Krenner was not the supreme leader. So the British were aware, and I have to say, after going through so many of their documents, they were completely confused and unaware as well. So that's a mixed bag right there. So in summary, since we're at an hour here, there's a legal distinction here. Rupnik's command of the Slovene Home Guard should not be conflated with Krenner's command of the reorganized from the Home Guard separate command structure to the Slovene National Army's National Command was part of a broader legal and political reorganization of Slovenia's anti-communist armed forces in May 1945. Okay, next time I will start from this point, and I've got quite a bit more to go over. But that's enough from me for today.
Yeah.
I did think it was important to go over the concept of why I am looking at illegal characteristics as opposed to political characteristics. Is a very important distinction, and from what I've seen, this really has not been carried out in Slovenia and looked at it from this point of view.
Indeed.
Go ahead.
So, just small remark that I like to watch different YouTube videos, of course, on history, and then you stumble upon Bulgaria or Romania, and you see that there, historically, there was so many changes in the wind, I would say, like different positions. Either people installed by Germans or people installed by Russians or Soviets, constantly. And but regarding Slovenia, no, we just have one truth for always, and these were the fixed story is only one. Mentality does not allow the different perspective on perhaps why they did it. Why were they using their precious time organizing Slovenska narodna vojska?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Why were they doing that? And their motivation behind doing it is key in any kind of legal characterization. And I agree, it's complex. There isn't just one story, and they all need to be written and discussed. And next week we'll continue doing that.
Thank you very much. I didn't see any aspirations for questions, so I think if there is a sign from anyone to ask quickly now, or I thank you.
We can answer it next week.
Yeah, we continue next week, same time. Bye.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.